Mikhail Gorbachev will always be remembered as the last Soviet leader, the one who ended the Soviet Union. Unusually young by Russian standards, he came to power challenging many of the country's inefficiencies and dogmas. Surprisingly personable, he waded into crowds where his predecessors suppressed them. Under Gorbachev's radical economic and political reforms, dubbed perestroika, communism crumbled, and so did the Iron Curtain that separated Moscow's puppet regimes in Eastern Europe from the West. In an interview with CBC 20 years after the end of the Cold War, he insisted this was the right course.
I am really proud of what happened. It was a very thorny path.
At home, that created many enemies. On one side, an old guard being swept away. On the other, firebrand liberals like Boris Yeltsin, for whom Gorbachev wasn't moving quickly enough. He was much more popular in the West, reaching out to U.S. Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Bush, seen as a man they could do business with, taking the edge off Cold War rivalries. Abroad, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. At home, he survived a coup attempt in 1991. And even now, Russian President Vladimir Putin uses what he calls Gorbachev's failures as justification for his own heavy hand.
And I think the younger generation of Russians who've been schooled under Putin will vilify Gorbachev as a man who sort of lost the empire and who gave in to these foreign Western influences.
Today, former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney remembered his Soviet counterpart.
He sought restraint on the exercise of military power, and this is the opposite of what we're witnessing now with this reckless and unacceptable war in Ukraine.
Two Gorbachev legacies that remain unreconciled, even in death. Sasha Petrusik, CBC News, Toronto.
Bringing in our Chris Brown in London tonight because Chris spent many years covering Russia. Chris, your impressions about how Russians themselves felt about Gorbachev?
Well, David, it's really quite striking the difference in how he was perceived in Russia versus seen in the West. Russian propagandists have spent a lot of time demonizing Gorbachev as the man responsible for ending the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin never really had a kind word for him. And within Russian society, generally, there was little thanks for Gorbachev for ending communism. We once, remember, chatted with people on the street around his 90th birthday, and I remember people mostly shrugging. And in fact, the lack of this legacy for Gorbachev is a good example of how Vladimir Putin has basically rewritten many parts of Russian history. For example, school textbooks now blame the Allies for starting the Second World War. And so, he's not seen as someone who contributed much. The 90s are seen as a time of chaos, when really, in fact, it was a blossoming time for civil society movements.
What do we know about how Gorbachev saw Putin's war with Ukraine?
We know that he was worried back in 2014 about a bigger war, also angry with the United States, accused them of arrogance. But in the last few months, we're told that he told friends that he was very angry with Putin for undoing all of his accomplishments and all the progress that perestroika had set in motion.
Chris Brown, always appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thanks, David.